Yeah, I was able to come to the Desert Botanical Gardens. It was in the spring sometime, but I'm really excited because most of my answers at that were, well, we're still trying to figure it out. We're still trying to learn this, especially related to the Conservation Grant Fund. So I have much more concrete answers that I can give this time around, and that's making me very happy. And so happy to share some of that. And just give you all an overview of what WIFA is as well, because I know a lot of you are familiar with us, a lot of you might not be. And just, to introduce myself, as Ann said, I am Chelsea McGuire. I'm the Assistant Director for External Affairs at WIFA. So my portfolio is basically everything that's outward facing, handling our legislative relationships, media and communications, kind of the first face of customer relationships. And it's a whole lot of fun to be able to do that and talk about who WIFA is and what we can do for you. So with that, I will get started just, kind of with the overview of who WIFA is. We're a small state agency, and we bring resources to Arizona communities specifically to address water challenges. So think a lot in the sort of green stormwater infrastructure space when I'm talking about some of the opportunities that we have. In 2002, our role significantly expanded. So we went from being kind of purely a financing authority to a new mission-oriented organization, with our mission including conservation and augmentation in addition to financing. And so that is really important to remember, that we're kind of building out some of these new programs, and that gives us the opportunity to be creative and innovative. But also it's not really a new model either, because using public money to fund infrastructure projects related to water is something Arizona's done for a really long time, right? It's how we have Hoover Dam in Lake Mead. It's how we have the Glen Canyon Dam in Lake Powell. It's how we have the CAP. So we're used to that model, but we're just in kind of a new context now here at WIFA. The other thing I like to remind folks of when I'm talking about who WIFA is that we are not a regulatory agency. That's our friends over at ADWR. That's our friends over at ADEQ, and they do a fantastic job with that, right? Arizona has decided sort of what are the rules, what are the parameters that we want to play in when it comes to water. WIFA gets to come alongside those agencies and then go to their customers and their stakeholders and say, those rules you have to comply with, how can we get you some resources to help you do that and to make that compliance more effective and more efficient and easier on your ratepayers? So that's what we get to do. I really like that role personally. And it's really indicative of how we're here to try to help communities comply and to do innovative and good things with water. So if you can go to the next slide, how do we do that? What is our method of help? It's money. That is really the resource that we have. That's the tool that we have to come in and say, how can we get these programs that you want to do up and running in your communities? We have 5 different funds that we administer at WIFA, and I tend to lump them into kind of 2 categories. Our federal funds, which are our state revolving funds. You'll see them called the SRFs. So that's what that means. Those are federal money. And then we have the new funds, quote unquote, and those are largely state money. So today we'll talk a little bit about both, but I'll focus probably a little bit more on the federal funds, just because I think those are going to be more relevant to some of your stormwater infrastructure kinds of projects. So Allison, if you can go to the next slide. What are our state revolving funds and who are they? This is what I call WIFA's bread and butter. This is what we've been doing for about 30 years, is administering clean water and drinking water loans with EPA capitalized grants. So the federal government makes money available through the EPA. We take that money and loan it out to communities to construct their projects. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund are funds for wastewater systems. And that can be used for wastewater treatment plant construction and upgrades. It can be used for non-point source projects. It can be upgrading failing decentralized systems. We're very, very excited about some of our septic to sewer opportunities that we have. And it can be used for stormwater infrastructure. And the eligible entities for that are public jurisdictions. So that means cities and towns, special districts, county improvement districts, tribal entities. The key is you need to have a public water systems ID number. That's kind of how you get in the door with WIFA. That's also going to be true for our drinking water funds, and that's to fund community water systems. So that could be public, private, or nonprofit projects like treatment and transportation, getting water where it needs to go at the quality it needs to be, distribution, storage, system consolidation, that kind of thing. Again, eligible entities for drinking water funds are publicly owned community water systems. You got to have that PWS number again, cities, towns, tribal entities, and special districts. So it's kind of what we're looking at when we talk about our state revolving funds. On the next slide, kind of gives you an idea of, why WIFA? What's the big deal, right? There are other ways, and there are a multitude of options for many communities or systems to go out and find financing. And WIFA is a bank, right? We are providing loans. There's going to be an interest and a payback component. So why should you go with WIFA? And I like to say it's because our lending programs are different. Our goal is to make these funds attractive to borrowers, and especially borrowers who might not have options to seek financing through things like private financing or bonding, really any other way, right? We want borrowers to choose WIFA because we meet your needs better than anybody else. And the first way we do that is to try to make these loans as cheap as possible. Maybe affordable is the word I should use, but cheap as possible. We're federally subsidized, right? We get capitalization grants every year from the EPA, which means that we're able to offer, and actually required to offer, discounted interest rates when we give out our loans. So depending on the project, your community, your eligibility, the kind of project, our borrowers can pay as little as 75%, 70% of the market interest rate at the time of closing. So when interest rates are super high, like they are right now, that can be really attractive because you're out there and you're getting that capital at a much lower interest rate than you can anywhere else on the private market. The other thing we can do is offer some flexible loan repayment. So we can take up to 30 years to repay a project, and that helps ratepayers not have that initial rate shock. It helps the systems figure out a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they're actually going to get that paid back. On the next slide, though, honestly, I think this is why we're really here. And this is why we're really popular with so many borrowers, because we can also give out some free money in addition to our cheap money, right? And the way that we do that is through forgivable principal. It's kind of a more recent tool that WIFA has started using, but it's one that we are really, really excited about because it can have a huge impact, especially on smaller systems and disadvantaged communities. So how does it work? Eligible borrowers who want to build particular projects can have some of that principal forgiven by WIFA. So you borrowed $1 million, you're only going to pay back $750,000. So $250 of that was free money to you, forgiven principal. That's not guaranteed. So you will hear me say eligible, you will hear me say kind of discretionary a lot of times in this presentation. But our board has been very clear that we want to do as much good as we can, especially in priority communities that have a real need, that are economically disadvantaged. And we'll talk about that definition as well. And so we are very excited about being able to give out forgivable principal. And so there are lots of good opportunities, especially for good projects. So there's two different ways, depending on the fund that you're talking about, of how this forgivable principal can be given out. So for the clean water SRF, that's the wastewater one, the first threshold is whether you're an eligible community. And on this chart here, we have A and B. So eligible community, you have to meet one of the two. Either you meet the disadvantaged community criteria, or your user rates will support the debt service. We've changed that disadvantage criteria recently, and I think I will get into that. Actually, I don't have a slide on that, so let me explain what that is. Disadvantaged community is actually a term that the EPA defines, and a disadvantaged community normally under EPA would be a colonia. So if you're familiar with that definition, it's pretty narrow, it's based on geography. A couple years ago, we realized at WIFA that that definition didn't work great for Arizona because there's so many communities who should meet that definition that just can't because of where they're located. And so we were able to get that definition modified to include systems who meet particular median household income. So a disadvantaged community now is any community whose median household income is 90% or less of the state median household income. So that opens up a lot of possibilities for a lot of forgivable principal and a lot of free money for different communities. So once you're in that eligible community, for For the Clean Water Fund, it's a percentage. So how much of that can be forgiven? All of it. If you've got a loan of less than $250,000 and it's resolving a non-point source pollution issue, 60% of it based on unemployment rates and population trends, and options for 50%, up to 50% forgivable if just you are that eligible community. And you'll see too that green projects and stormwater projects are also eligible for 20% of the eligible project costs, and that's regardless of your community status, right? So there you are. We want to incentivize those kinds of projects. So there is some discounted rates available for that. On the next slide, which is far less confusing, I think, on the drinking water SRF, again, the threshold here is whether you're a disadvantaged community, and then also whether you are addressing a public health threat. If both of those things are true, you can walk through that loan and see what the options for forgivable principal are for you. One of the great examples of projects that I like to use on this is one that we're still working on and trying to get finalized in Gila County, and that's cesspool removal. And so in Gila County, this cesspool removal project will be a $250,000 project, which means we can do it entirely forgiven. And that's awesome because the homeowners there, the landowners there, can't afford to remove the cesspools, but they also can't do anything with their land until the cesspools are removed. And so we're really giving an opportunity for that community to do something good that has a huge environmental benefit, a huge public health benefit, but also a really tangible economic benefit as well. All right, on the next slide, I always like to give this little presentation or this little shout out because it really shows just how much impact these state revolving funds have had within our state. For the last 30 years, which is how long WIFA has been around, we've given out nearly $3 billion in loans. That number is probably over $3 billion now based on what we did in fiscal year 2023. So we're extremely excited about that. $102 million in forgivable principal. That number is probably up to about $150 million now. So again, huge opportunities for that. A lot of money coming on the ground, especially because of bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation and Jobs Act. So keep that in mind as you're looking for some of these projects. It may be a really good option for you to use WIFA as one of your funding sources. All right, and on the next slide, the three new funds, these are the state money funds that I talked about. These are probably a little bit less stormwater infrastructure focused, but I will walk through the two that I think are the most helpful to you in a little bit of detail. So we have three of these funds. I keep saying new. You'll see that one of them isn't exactly new, but we'll talk about that later. The first being the Water Conservation Grant Fund. That's $200 million in grants right now. Water Supply Development Revolving Fund, that's $190 million available in that fund. And the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund, that's the $1 billion investment in water. So all of these pretty big, some pretty cool opportunities. The next slide, we'll talk about Water Conservation Grant Fund. And this is the one that I think I'm maybe most excited about just because of how much good it's doing and will be doing in Arizona very immediately and very much right now. So Arizona chose in 2022 to invest $200 million in this new fund. And the idea was, if we're going to invest in long-term augmentation, we also want to be investing in immediate term conservation because we want to use our water as effectively as possible. That's a fantastic goal. We absolutely agree. So there's $200 million available. Grants are available for up to $3 million with a 25% match requirement. So that would be a total of about a $3.7 million program or project. Only program. So back to the Water Conservation Grant Fund, $3 million per program, so up to $3 million grant. And the eligible entities on this one are slightly different than our other funds. Eligible entities are water providers. This is a term of art, it's in statute, and it's defined a particular way. So it includes those government entities, cities, towns, districts, all of that. Also includes tribal entities, natural resource conservation districts, but it can also include an NGO who partners with one of those eligible entities. So the NGO could be the lead on the project. They're actually doing the work, they're getting the money on the ground, but the eligible entity they're partnering with is what makes it possible for us to actually cut that check to them. So there is a little more flexibility there to get some of the money on the ground. On the next slide, you'll see kind of where we are in this fund. Because the 200 million came from federal COVID relief money, it was American Rescue Plan Act money, we're pretty time sensitive when it comes to this fund. So we got it out really, really quickly. We kind of learned as we went, as we were going through this. And right now we have 212 applications for about $250 million. So you'll see that's actually more than what we have requested more than what we have available to give. In my opinion, that's a super high quality problem to have, because that shows just what appetite there is out there for conservation programs, like anything that reduces water use, right? And so I think there are some applications where there could be conservation that has multiple benefits. And it might not be a traditional water conservation project, but if there is that conservation aspect to it, either you're decreasing evapotranspiration, you're adding shade, and that's using less water, you're tearing out a water intensive landscaping to put in a less water intensive landscaping that's also shade providing, all of those things could be eligible. So Allison, if you can click one more time, we still have applications open. I know I just said we have more requested than we have funds. That's okay. If you are an eligible entity and you're thinking about applying, we still want to see your application. That's for a couple of reasons. The first is that we might not, it's a competitive program, right? So we will not apply, or we will not approve every single grant application that comes across the board's desk. So put it in there just in case it's something that rises to the top of the rest of the applications. The other reason I think it's really important to get the application in is that shows and signals to the state just how much appetite there is for these conservation dollars. Our goal as WIFA is not to make this a one and done kind of program. Our goal as WIFA is to say this needs to be perpetual. We want to show the benefit of the program and go back to the legislature and ask for additional funding. So if you can help us do that and show what demand there is out there for conservation programs, that would be even better. On the next slide, you'll see the Water Supply Development Revolving Fund. Now, this is why I keep saying these are new funds, but not exactly new. This is more like a newly funded fund. It's been around since about 2012, but it's never had money to do anything. And so when we were making all the investments in water in 2022, this was another sort of not compromise, but another aspect of that investment that was really important to the legislature, because we've got conservation money, that's great. We're going to have this augmentation fund, which is kind of going to bring more expensive water into the state. But what are we doing for rural areas? What are we doing for the corners of Arizona who also need water supply development resources, but might not be able to afford augmented water? And that's really what this is for. And this is sort of an interesting combination of a grant and a loan. The legislation is very broad and tells us that we can give grants of up to 2 million, loans of up to 3 million. So we're going to treat this a lot like our state revolving funds, where we're offering subsidized loans because we have the money available from the state. So this is going to rotate, but pretty slowly in terms of a fund. But using that grant ability, we can give forgivable principal in those loans. Then there will also be opportunities for just clear grants, or for kind of pure grants from the fund as well. So you don't necessarily have to go through all that debt authorization process and that kind of thing. The eligibility for this fund, same water providers, right? So talking about the cities, towns, public districts, public entities, but they have to be located essentially outside of the CAP service area. So outside of the Phoenix, Pinal, or Tucson AMAs, really truly focused on rural Arizona. And the goals of this fund is water supply development. And so I think some of that stormwater infrastructure may be part of that, especially if there's any kind of reuse or that kind of element to it. Anything groundwater replenishment, and also conservation. So there's a lot of flexibility within this fund as well. All right, and then last but not least, we do have the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund. This isn't necessarily relevant to what we're talking about here, but always have to do our plug. A total of $1 billion has been committed to WIFA over the next 3 years to go and find new water. Or at least 3/4 of that has to be new water that's not currently in our state. So it has to come from outside the state's borders. Up to 25% of that can also be used to make additional in-state supplies available for use. So talking about reuse, talking about additional storage, that kind of thing. We are working right now to figure out exactly what our universe of augmentation looks like. We have an RFI that is live. We are working on building a solicitation for a project. lots of exciting things happening on a maybe a bigger scale and less of a sort of individual project basis. But definitely keep an eye on this because I think it's going to do some exciting and really important things for the state coming up. So on the next slide is my contact information. That's what I have to share with you today. Again, apologies for the random tech glitch, but happy to take any questions from here and hopefully answer anything that I didn't for you in the presentation.